Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready for some serious 60s vibes?
Always.
Today, we're diving into one of music's biggest mysteries, or at least one that people love to argue about.
Ah, you must mean Yoko Ono and the Beatles.
Bingo. We've got a mountain of articles, a couple of biographies, even a podcast episode all about them.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
We do.
Yeah.
But it's more than just, rehashing old gossip. It's about, personalities colliding, art going against the grain, and how we remember, or maybe misremember, history.
You hit the nail on the head. For years, it was all Yoko broke up the Beatles. Case closed.
Right. Like it was that simple. So was it? Were John and Yoko really the villains in some rock and roll soap opera?
Or is there a whole other side to this story?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's our mission today, to uncover what really went down.
Sounds good to me.
So, before we jump into the drama, let's paint a picture of Yoko before she met John. What was her world like? What shaped her as an artist?
Well, her story starts way before she ever stepped foot in a London gallery. Born in 1933, she's from one of Japan's wealthiest families.
Wow, talk about privilege.
Right. But even with all that wealth, her childhood was, well, lonely. She describes this emotional distance from her parents, even with all the material things.
It's funny how those things don't always line up, right?
Yeah.
You can have it all and still feel empty.
Exactly. And she really brings this to life with these vivid memories, like her dad's huge desk being a wall between them.
Oof, I feel that.
Or how she could never hug her mom without, touching fur and perfect nails. It really paints a picture of this childhood that was rich on the outside, but lacking something deeper.
Those details are so powerful. It's like a window into her world, even as a little kid.
Totally. And you start to see how those early experiences, those feelings of isolation, could have shaped her art later on, how she became so unconventional and, well, a little bit rebellious.
It makes you wonder if that's what pushed her to make art that was so different, so provocative.
Absolutely. Like she was trying to break free from those early constraints. And her life took some wild turns before she landed in the New York art scene. 2 marriages, a suicide attempt. She was even institutionalized for a while.
Wow, that's a lot to carry.
Definitely. But she came out of it all as a force to be reckoned with in the art world. By the early 60s, she was making a name for herself, known for her avant-garde, sometimes shocking work.
Okay, so we have Yoko, this bold artist, shaking things up. Now let's rewind and talk about John. What was his life like before they met? What shaped him?
John's story, much like Yoko's, is full of early trauma and this constant search for love and belonging.
It's interesting how they both had these difficult childhoods despite coming from such different worlds, one super wealthy, the other working class.
Right. It's like these parallel paths in a way. So John, born in 1940, lived through World War II as a kid, but what really hit him hard was his family falling apart. His dad walked out when he was just 5, and his mom, Julia, well, society decided she wasn't fit to raise him.
So he ended up with his aunt.
Yep, Aunt Mimi, who was way stricter and not exactly warm and fuzzy.
You can see how that would affect a kid, especially someone as sensitive as John seems to have been.
Absolutely. And it seems like those early wounds never really healed. Throughout his life, he struggled with this feeling of abandonment, insecurity, needing everyone to like him.
And you see that playing out in his relationships too.
All the time. The sources talk about this pattern of getting super attached, then getting angry or even violent when he felt his needs weren't being met.
It's heartbreaking,
Yeah.
This incredibly talented guy carrying so much pain. And you wonder how much that fueled his music, his genius, but also maybe some of his bad behavior.
For sure, it's a complex picture. And even with the Beatles, you see similar dynamics. He often acted like it was his band, having a hard time sharing the credit, especially with Paul McCartney.
Ah, that famous rivalry. Seems like there was always this push and pull between them. John needing to be the best, but also scared of being overshadowed.
Definitely. And it created friction within the band. John could be possessive, controlling, especially when he was feeling insecure.
It's like the seeds of their breakup were already there, even before Yoko came along. They had clashing personalities, different ideas about their music, and then the pressure of being global superstars on top of it all.
Right. It was a ticking time bomb.
And then, bam, 1966, their paths collide at Yoko's art show in London.
And everything changes. Or at least that's how the story goes.
But like we said, we're here to dig deeper, to see what's really going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. And as we explore their individual stories and how they came together, I think we're going to find that this whole Yoko and the Beatles saga is much more complicated than anyone gives it credit for.
Well, I'm ready to dive in. What do you say?
Let's do it. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Still with us as we unpack this whole Yoko Ono and the Beatles saga.
Wouldn't miss it. We left off with John and Yoko's fateful meeting. Their lives, their art, everything's about to change.
Big time. And remember, they both came with their own baggage, which definitely shaped how things played out. So what was it about Yoko that drew John in? What did she represent for him?
Yeah, it's like, what did he see in her that was missing in his own life at that point?
Well, remember, John was already battling those insecurities, constantly needing approval. Yoko, with her art, her confidence, it was like she embodied this freedom he craved. She wasn't afraid to break the rules in art and in life.
She was a rebel in the best sense of the word.
Totally. And her whole artistic philosophy, being positive, pushing boundaries, thinking outside the box, it really resonated with John. He was drawn to that. Her intellectual side, her fearlessness, that belief that art could change the world.
Yeah, and then there's that story about their first encounter at her gallery, the piece that just said yes.
That's the one. So simple, yet so powerful, especially in the world of rock and roll, which can be pretty cynical.
Totally. It's like she was giving him permission to be himself, to break free from expectations.
Yep. Exactly. Imagine John at the height of his fame, surrounded by fans, but feeling empty inside. And here's Yoko, this artist he barely knows, offering this simple affirmation. Yes. It's like she was saying, yes, you can be different. Yes, you can challenge the norm. Yes, you can be your true self.
Powerful stuff. Like she offered him an escape route from the craziness of his fame.
Spot on. And that connection, it quickly turned into this passionate romance. But remember, both of them were married to other people at the time.
Yeah, that's where things get messy, right? A lot of hurt feelings, difficult choices.
Definitely. Secret letters, stolen moments, it was a whirlwind. And as they got closer, their existing marriages started to crumble.
John's behavior during this time, not his finest hour, to say the least.
No, he was reckless, emotionally speaking. Absent from his marriage, multiple affairs, he treated Cynthia pretty badly.
Right. And while we can't condone that, it's important to understand the context. He was deeply unhappy, struggling with addiction, looking for something, someone to fill that void.
And Yoko, in a lot of ways, became that person. And as her influence grew, the tension within the Beatles started to rise. John was getting more and more absorbed in her world, her avant-garde ideas, her activism. His focus was shifting.
The other Beatles, they must have felt it, like a threat almost.
Absolutely. They saw Yoko as a distraction, someone who didn't belong in their tight-knit world. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. John started bringing Yoko to recording sessions, incorporating her ideas into their music, putting her needs ahead of the band.
That studio thing, that was a major turning point, right?
Yeah.
A clear sign to the others, especially Paul, that this wasn't just a fling, this was serious.
Huge turning point. And John, with his need for approval and his addiction issues, he wasn't handling it well. He could be dismissive, defensive, quick to anger when anyone questioned him.
So you have this volatile mix, clashing personalities, creative differences, addiction, and then the pressure cooker of their global fame. And Yoko, she becomes the easy target, the scapegoat.
It's easier to blame the outsider, especially a woman who doesn't fit the mold, than to face the complex reality of what was tearing the band apart.
And remember, this is the late 60s. The world is changing fast, Vietnam War, counterculture movement, everything's in flux. It's a time ripe for change, but also a time of anxiety and uncertainty.
And John and Yoko, with their unconventional relationship and their outspoken activism, they represented that tension. They were pushing boundaries, challenging the status quo, refusing to conform.
They became this lightning rod, attracting both fascination and fear.
Exactly. Their story, it reflects those anxieties of the time. And that's why it still resonates with us today. It's about love, loss, betrayal, artistic evolution, navigating fame and fortune in a world on the brink of transformation.
So, amidst all this drama, John and Yoko get married in March of 1969. And for their honeymoon, they decide to hold a bed-in for peace. Talk about a statement.
Bold move. They took something incredibly intimate, something private, and turned it into this public spectacle, inviting the world's media into their hotel room to witness their message of peace and love.
That it also sparked a lot of controversy, right? People ridiculed them, called them naive, attention-seeking.
The media had a field day. A lot of folks just didn't get it, their message or their methods. Back then, protest was usually associated with anger, confrontation. John and Yoko, they offered a different path, one based on love, optimism, nonviolence.
And that was unsettling for some, I imagine.
Definitely. It challenged people's ideas about how change should happen, who had the right to advocate for it. And Yoko, being a woman, an Asian woman, she became a particular target. People painted her as controlling, manipulative, reinforcing those harmful stereotypes that were so prevalent back then.
It's a classic example of how society treats women who challenge the status quo. They get demonized, turned into caricatures.
Exactly. Yoko's very presence challenged those traditional ideas about femininity and artistic expression. She wasn't content to be the quiet, supportive wife. She was an artist, a force to be reckoned with.
And her relationship with John, so unconventional, so public, it further challenged those norms. They were visible, vocal, unapologetically different kind of couple.
And that made them both fascinating and threatening to the public. So it's against this backdrop of personal turmoil, creative tension, and societal upheaval that the Beatles' final years play out.
The band was already imploding, but Yoko became the scapegoat, the easy target for blame.
People needed someone to blame, and she fit the bill perfectly. But as we've seen, it's not that simple. It's a story about clashing personalities, artistic differences, addiction, the pressures of fame. It's about the challenges of holding on to creative partnerships when everything around you is changing.
And in our final part, we'll explore what happened after the Beatles split up, the lasting impact of that Yoko broke up the Beatles myth, and the complex legacy of Yoko Ono as an artist, activist, and cultural icon. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We spent the last two parts really getting into the world of Yoko Ono, her art, and her relationship with John and the whole Beatles scene.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. We've seen how their pasts, both kind of marked by those early struggles, led them to this whirlwind romance that, well, it challenged a lot of norms and really shook up the music world.
And we dove into the inner workings of the band, all the creative clashes, the personal demons, the external pressures, all those things that ultimately led to their breakup.
And of course, we talked about how Yoko often became the scapegoat, the one blamed for the band's ending, which, as we've seen, wasn't really fair.
Right. So now we're at the aftermath.
Okay.
What happened after the Beatles went their separate ways? How did John and Yoko navigate life after Beatlemania, both individually and as a couple?
You know, in many ways, their relationship actually became stronger once the Beatles were done. They had this newfound freedom away from the band, the constant media frenzy, the expectations of their fans.
They could finally just be themselves, focus on their shared artistic vision and their passion for activism.
Exactly. They kept collaborating on music, released a bunch of albums together, staged more of those bed-ins for peace, this time even adding environmentalism and women's rights to their message.
Wow, so their activism really expanded.
It did. It became more global. They traveled all over, met world leaders, spoke out against war, poverty, all kinds of injustices. They truly were a power couple, using their platform to fight for a better world.
It's inspiring to see them using their fame for something so meaningful. But I imagine their personal lives still had their share of challenges.
Oh, definitely. John's addiction issues didn't just disappear. And his relationship with Julian, his son from his first marriage, it remained pretty strained.
That's sad to hear. It's a reminder that fame and fortune don't erase those personal struggles.
Exactly. And Yoko had her own heartbreak to deal with. Her daughter, Kyoko, from her second marriage, was kidnapped by her ex-husband and basically vanished for almost 3 decades.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that. That's absolutely devastating. Imagine the pain of not knowing where your child is for that long.
It's unimaginable, and it's a story that often gets overshadowed by all the other drama surrounding them. It's a reminder that behind the public image, there were real people with real struggles, real heartbreaks.
Right. They weren't just characters in this Beatles saga. They were human beings going through life's ups and downs, just like the rest of us. And then, in 1980, tragedy struck again. John's assassination. It just sent shockwaves through the world.
It was a senseless act of violence that robbed the world of a musical icon, a peace activist, a truly complex and fascinating individual. For Yoko, it was the loss of her soulmate, her partner in everything.
I can't even imagine the pain she must have felt. But even in the face of such a devastating loss, she showed incredible strength and resilience.
She did. She continued to champion John's legacy, keeping his music alive, spreading his message of peace. And she never stopped pursuing her own artistic passions, releasing albums, creating art installations, pushing boundaries.
She became a powerful voice in her own right, speaking out for peace, environmentalism, women's rights.
And she's always been vocal about setting the record straight on that whole Yoko broke up the Beatles myth.
She's right to challenge those simplistic narratives. Like we've discussed, the Beatles were already heading towards a split. They were creatively restless, exhausted, and struggling to stay unified under all that pressure.
Yoko just became an easy target, a scapegoat for a situation that was far more complicated.
And sadly, her artistic contributions, both during and after her time with John, often get overlooked.
Her work, just like her life, is multifaceted, challenging. It forces you to think, to engage with it on its own terms.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what do you think? How should we remember Yoko Ono? What's her legacy?
I think she'll be remembered as a true trailblazer, an artist who dared to be different, a woman who challenged norms, who pushed boundaries,
A fearless advocate for peace and social justice, a voice that refused to be silenced.
and of course, as the woman who loved John Lennon, who shared his artistic journey, and
Wow.
who experienced both the incredible highs and the devastating lows of a relationship that unfolded in the global spotlight.
Her story speaks to the power of individuality, resilience, and the potential of art to change how we see the world.
It reminds us to look beyond the headlines, to question easy answers, and to appreciate the complexity of human lives in all their messy and magnificent forms.
Well said. This has been an incredible deep dive, full of surprises and insights.
I agree. It's amazing how much there is to uncover when you dig a little deeper.
And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this journey into the world of Yoko Ono and the Beatles. If you did, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive for more fascinating explorations.
We'll see you next time.